The rise of China. For thousands of years, China stood among the greatest civilizations on Earth. It was the birthplace of inventions that transformed human history: paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass. Across vast plains, towering mountains, and fertile river valleys, dynasties rose and fell, shaping an empire unlike any other. Stretching from the Pacific coastline to the towering Himalayas, and from the frozen northern steppes to the tropical shores of the South China Sea, China ruled over one of the largest and most populated states the world had ever known. Its people called their homeland Zhongguo the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization itself. For more than 2,000 years, Chinese emperors claimed that heaven had granted them the sacred right to rule all under heaven. Their authority was absolute, their dynasty believed to be the bridge between the heavens and the earth. By the 17th century, this immense empire had come under the rule of the Qing Dynasty. Although its emperors were Manchu rather than Han Chinese, they governed a realm whose size and wealth astonished foreign visitors. By the early 19th century, Qing China covered more than 14 million square kilometers. Around one-third of the world's population lived within its borders, and many historians estimate that China produced nearly one-third of global economic output. Magnificent cities such as Beijing, Nanjing, and Canton ranked among the largest urban centers on Earth. Merchants, scholars, artisans, and officials filled bustling streets where commerce flourished beneath ornate temples and imperial palaces. Unlike the expanding colonial empires of Europe, Qing China viewed itself not as a nation seeking conquest, but as the natural center of a harmonious world order. This vision was deeply rooted in the teachings of Confucius, whose philosophy had shaped Chinese society for over 2 millennia. Respect for parents and ancestors, loyalty to one's ruler, moral discipline, and social harmony formed the foundation of everyday life. Every individual was expected to understand their place within society, creating an orderly hierarchy that emphasized stability over change. Government reflected these same ideals. Young men from wealthy families devoted years, sometimes decades, to mastering the Confucian classics. Only by passing the grueling imperial civil service examinations could they hope to join the empire's elite bureaucracy. Success brought prestige, wealth, and influence. Failure often meant a lifetime of disappointment. This merit-based system had once made China one of the world's most sophisticated governments. But by the 19th century, what had once been a source of strength had gradually become a source of weakness. While Europe raced through the Industrial Revolution and modern science transformed warfare, transportation, and manufacturing, Qing officials remained committed to traditions that had changed little for centuries. China still viewed itself as self-sufficient. Foreign merchants were permitted to trade only through the southern port of Canton, under strict government supervision. The Qing court believed that limiting outside influence would preserve stability. Instead, it left the empire dangerously isolated from a rapidly changing world. That isolation would soon be shattered. In 1839, China entered what later generations would remember as the century of humiliation. For years, British merchants had illegally flooded China with opium grown in British India. The drug trade generated enormous profits for Britain. But inside China, it created a devastating addiction crisis that spread through every level of society. Determined to end the catastrophe, Qing officials seized and destroyed massive quantities of opium in Canton. Britain answered not with diplomacy, but with war. Steam-powered warships armed with modern artillery overwhelmed China's outdated navy with shocking ease. The conflict ended in a humiliating Chinese defeat. Under the Treaty of Nanjing, the Qing government was forced to open several ports to British trade, grant extensive commercial privileges, and surrender Hong Kong to Britain. It was the first of many unequal treaties that foreign powers would impose upon China. France, the United States, and other Western nations soon demanded similar concessions. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire exploited China's growing weakness to seize vast territories in the northeast. Foreign influence spread while imperial authority steadily declined. Yet even greater disaster was about to strike from within. While foreign powers chipped away at China's sovereignty, an even greater catastrophe erupted from within. In 1850, a massive rebellion exploded across southern China. Its leader, Han Shuk-wan, claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ and declared that he had been chosen by God to overthrow the Qing Dynasty. His followers established what they called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, promising equality, land reform, and a new divine order. Millions of desperate peasants, crushed by poverty, famine, and official corruption, rallied to his cause. Within just a few years, the rebellion had grown into one of the largest civil wars in human history. The Taiping army swept across central and southern China, capturing city after city before seizing Nanjing, which they transformed into their heavenly capital. For 14 years, the Qing Empire fought desperately to destroy the rebels. Farmland lay abandoned as millions fled the violence. The human cost was almost unimaginable. Modern estimates suggest that around 20 to 40 million people perished through combat, famine, and disease, making the Taiping Rebellion one of the deadliest conflicts ever recorded. Although the Qing Dynasty eventually emerged victorious, it paid a terrible price. The empire's treasury was exhausted. Its military reputation lay in ruins. Regional governors had gained unprecedented power by raising their own armies to defeat the rebels, weakening the authority of the imperial court in Beijing. China survived, but it was no longer the dominant power it had once been. Its rivals were growing stronger. Among them was a nation that had long lived in China's shadow, Japan. For centuries, Chinese elites had viewed Japan as a lesser civilization influenced by Chinese culture. But during the second half of the 19th century, Japan transformed itself with astonishing speed. Following the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese government embraced industrialization, modern education, advanced technology, and Western military methods. Factories multiplied. Railways spread across the islands. A modern navy replaced aging wooden ships. Within a single generation, Japan had become an emerging industrial power. China, meanwhile, struggled to reform. Conservative officials resisted sweeping modernization, fearing that rapid change would undermine the Confucian order that had governed the empire for centuries. The consequences became painfully clear in 1894. Disputes over influence in Korea erupted into war between China and Japan. Confident in the size of their empire, many Qing leaders expected an easy victory. Instead, they suffered a devastating defeat. The modern Japanese army consistently outmaneuvered Chinese forces, while the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyed much of China's once proud Beiyang fleet. The resulting Treaty of Shimonoseki forced China to recognize Korean independence, surrender Taiwan, and grant Japan additional commercial privileges. The defeat sent shock waves throughout Asia. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated the Chinese Empire using modern industry, technology, and military organization. Across Europe and America, newspapers mocked China as the sick man of Asia. To many observers, the once mighty empire appeared incapable of defending itself against either Western imperialism or its rapidly modernizing neighbors. Inside China, humiliation gave birth to anger. Scholars, merchants, soldiers, and ordinary citizens increasingly questioned whether the Qing dynasty could still protect the nation. Calls for reform grew louder. Others demanded revolution. As the 19th century drew to a close, frustration reached a boiling point. In northern China, secret societies began organizing resistance against foreign influence and the Qing government's repeated concessions. Among them was a movement known as the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Foreigners would soon give them a different name, the Boxes. As the 19th century came to a close, resentment toward foreign domination spread rapidly across northern China. Farmers struggled through years of drought and economic hardship. Missionaries continued expanding Christian influence. Foreign businesses built railways and factories while enjoying privileges that ordinary Chinese citizens could never hope to receive. Many believed the Qing government had become too weak to defend the nation. Out of this growing frustration emerged a secret movement calling itself the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Foreign journalists gave them a simpler name, the Boxers. The Boxers believed China could only regain its dignity by driving out all foreign influence. To them, Christian missionaries represented cultural invasion. Foreign merchants symbolized economic exploitation, and the Qing court itself had become an embarrassment, repeatedly bowing to outside powers after every military defeat. The movement quickly gained support across northern China. Its followers attacked railway lines, telegraph networks, churches, and Christian communities. Foreign diplomats watched the violence spread with increasing alarm. In the summer of 1900, thousands of Boxers marched into Beijing. They surrounded the city's diplomatic quarter, trapping foreign ambassadors, civilians, missionaries, and Chinese Christians behind hastily constructed defenses. For nearly 2 months, the legation quarter remained under constant siege. The Qing court now faced an impossible choice: suppress the Boxers and risk appearing to defend foreign interests, or support them and confront the world's most powerful military powers. The decision ultimately rested with Empress Dowager Cixi, the formidable woman who had dominated Qing politics for decades. Believing that the uprising offered a chance to expel foreign influence once and for all, she made a dramatic gamble. Rather than crushing the Boxers, she declared war on the foreign powers and ordered Qing troops to fight alongside them. It was one of the most consequential miscalculations in Chinese history. The response from abroad was swift. 8 nations, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary formed an international expeditionary force. Modern armies advanced toward Beijing with overwhelming firepower. Chinese resistance quickly collapsed. After fierce fighting, the Allied forces entered the capital. What followed was a wave of looting, executions, and widespread destruction. The Boxers were crushed. The Qing government fled Beijing. China was forced to accept yet another humiliating settlement. The Boxer Protocol, signed in 1901, imposed crushing financial penalties that would burden the country for decades. Foreign troops gained the right to remain permanently stationed in Beijing. China's sovereignty suffered another devastating blow. For many Chinese, this marked the lowest point of the Qing Dynasty. The empire had failed not only to defeat foreign armies, but even to protect its own capital. It had become painfully clear that survival required profound change. Reluctantly, the Qing court launched its most ambitious reform program in centuries. The ancient Imperial Civil Service Examination, the institution that had selected government officials for nearly 1,300 years, was abolished. Modern schools replaced classical academies. Students were encouraged to study science, engineering, mathematics, law, and Western political ideas. Military reforms created new academies based on European models. Modern rifles, artillery, and professional officer training gradually replaced outdated methods. Plans were even drafted for a constitutional monarchy that would limit the emperor's absolute authority. But for many reformers, these changes came far too late. China needed more than reform. It needed an entirely new political system. Among the strongest advocates for revolution was a physician from Guangdong province. His name was Sun Yat-sen. Unlike the traditional Confucian scholar officials who dominated Qing politics, Sun had received much of his education overseas, including in Hawaii. He spoke fluent English, embraced modern science, and converted to Christianity. Exposure to Western political thought convinced him that China's future depended on ending imperial rule altogether. After participating in several failed uprisings against the Qing government, Sun was forced into exile. Rather than abandon his dream, he spent years traveling across Asia, Europe, and North America. raising funds and building support among overseas Chinese communities. In 1905, while living in Tokyo, he united several revolutionary organizations into a single alliance known as the Tongminghui, or the Revolutionary Alliance. Its objective was clear: overthrow the Qing Dynasty, end Manchu rule, and establish a modern republic based on the principles of nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihood. To an increasing number of young Chinese, Sun Yat-sen represented something the Qing court no longer could: hope. And events were about to move faster than anyone expected. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Qing dynasty stood on the edge of collapse. Foreign intervention had shattered China's prestige. Reform efforts had failed to restore public confidence. Revolutionary movements continued to grow, while dissatisfaction spread through every level of society, from students and merchants to soldiers and government officials. Then, in 1908, the empire suffered another devastating blow. After ruling China for nearly half a century, Empress Dowager Cixi died at the age of 72. Only a day earlier, the Guangxu Emperor had also passed away under mysterious circumstances. With both of the empire's dominant figures gone, the imperial throne fell to a child barely 2 years old. His name was Pui. The new emperor was too young to understand the immense crisis surrounding him. Real authority rested in the hands of regents and senior officials, many of whom disagreed over how China should be governed. Across the country, revolutionary organizations sensed that the dynasty had never been more vulnerable. The spark that ignited the revolution came almost by accident. On October 9, 1911, members of a secret revolutionary group in the city of Hankou were assembling explosives when one of the bombs detonated prematurely. The explosion exposed their identities. Police raided their headquarters, arresting several conspirators. Executions soon followed. Instead of crushing the movement, the crackdown accelerated it. The following day, sympathetic soldiers stationed in nearby Wuchang rose in open rebellion. Many belonged to the newly modernized army established during the Qing reforms. Unlike earlier uprisings, these troops possessed modern weapons, military training, and organized leadership. After fierce fighting lasting less than 24 hours, the revolutionaries captured the city. A provisional military government was established almost immediately. Its leaders publicly denounced the Qing dynasty and called upon every province in China to join the revolution. Their appeal spread with astonishing speed. Province after province declared independence from Qing rule. In many regions, local officials simply abandoned the imperial government rather than resist. Elsewhere, fighting erupted as revolutionary forces clashed with loyalist troops. Long-suppressed ethnic tensions also exploded into violence. Some Manchu communities became targets of brutal revenge attacks by Han Chinese revolutionaries determined to erase the symbols of Qing authority. Within only 6 weeks, 16 of China's 26 provinces had declared their support for the revolution. The Qing court in Beijing was overwhelmed. Desperate to save the dynasty, the imperial government turned to the empire's most capable military commander, General Yuan Shikai. Yuan commanded the powerful Beiyang army, China's best trained and best equipped military force. The court hoped he could crush the uprising and restore order. Instead, Yuan carefully weighed his options. Rather than committing fully to either side, he negotiated with both the Qing court and the revolutionaries, positioning himself as the one man capable of determining China's future. Meanwhile, the revolution continued to spread. Amid the growing chaos, China's frontiers also began to unravel. Outer Mongolia declared its independence. Tibet moved towards self-rule. The vast empire assembled by the Qing dynasty was beginning to fragment. Despite these uncertainties, revolutionary leaders pushed forward. On January 1, 1912, representatives gathered in Nanjing and formally proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of China. After years spent organizing revolutions from exile, Sun Yat-sen finally returned home. He was sworn in as the Republic's provisional president. For Sun and his supporters, this marked the realization of a dream decades in the making. The new government wasted little time introducing reforms. A democratic constitution was drafted. Symbols of imperial rule began disappearing from public life. The traditional queue hairstyle, long required as a sign of loyalty to the Qing Dynasty, was abolished. Foot binding, which had crippled generations of Chinese women, was officially outlawed. Ceremonial practices symbolizing submission to imperial authority were discarded. The new republic declared that all citizens, regardless of ethnicity, would belong equally to the nation. Its five-colored flag represented unity among the empire's major peoples: Han, Manchu, Mongol, Hui Muslim, and Tibetan. Yet beneath the optimism, a harsh reality remained. The republic existed largely on paper. Its authority extended mainly across southern China. The North and China's most powerful army remained under Yuan Shikai's control. Sun Yat-sen understood that without Yuan's cooperation, the revolution could easily descend into a prolonged civil war. So he made a remarkable decision. Rather than cling to power, Sun offered Yuan the presidency of the new republic. In return, Yuan would persuade the Qing court to abdicate peacefully. For Yuan, it was an irresistible opportunity. He approached the imperial family with a stark choice: voluntarily surrender the throne or risk complete destruction. Facing overwhelming pressure and with few loyal forces remaining, the Qing court accepted the inevitable. On February 12, 1912, the young Emperor Pui formally abdicated. Although he would continue living inside Beijing's Forbidden City for several years, his reign had effectively ended before it truly began. With a single document, more than 2,000 years of imperial rule in China came to an end. One of the world's oldest continuous monarchies had fallen. In its place stood Asia's first modern republic, but the revolution had solved only one problem. The struggle over who would control the new China was just beginning. On February 15, 1912, only days after the Qing Emperor's abdication, Yuan Shikai was sworn in as the provisional president of the Republic of China. For the moment, it appeared that compromise had succeeded where decades of conflict had failed. The Qing Dynasty was gone. China had become a republic without descending into a prolonged civil war. Yet beneath this peaceful transition lay a dangerous reality. The republic possessed a constitution, but real power still rested with the army, and the army answered to Yuan Shikai. Unlike Sun Yat-sen, whose authority came from revolutionary ideals and popular support, Yuan commanded the country's most powerful military force. Thousands of experienced soldiers remained personally loyal to him rather than to the new government. Many revolutionaries believed they had made a necessary sacrifice. They hoped Yuan would respect the constitution, strengthen the republic, and eventually allow democratic institutions to flourish. For a brief moment, that hope seemed justified. Political parties emerged across the country. Newspapers debated China's future with an openness unimaginable under imperial rule. Citizens discussed democracy, constitutional government, and national renewal with growing enthusiasm. To represent the revolutionary movement, Sun Yat-sen reorganized his political alliance into a modern party known as the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party. Its goal was to defend the young republic and ensure that political authority remained accountable to elected representatives rather than military strongmen. At the end of 1912, China held its first nationwide parliamentary elections. Although only a small percentage of the population qualified to vote, primarily educated men and property owners, it was nevertheless a historic milestone. For the first time in thousands of years, representatives would be chosen through ballots instead of imperial appointment. The results were decisive. The Kuomintang emerged as the largest political party, winning nearly half the seats in the new National Assembly. Victory positioned the party to form China's first constitutional government. Its rising star was Song Jiao-ren, a brilliant young political strategist and one of Sun Yat-sen's closest allies. Song believed the republic could only survive if the military remained subordinate to civilian authority. As leader of the victorious parliamentary majority, he appeared destined to become China's first constitutional prime minister. But before he could take office, tragedy struck. On March 20th, 1913, Song arrived at Shanghai Railway Station to board a train for Beijing. As he walked across the platform, a gunman approached and fired several shots at close range. Song collapsed before shocked witnesses. He died 2 days later. The assassination sent shock waves across the country, although investigators never uncovered definitive proof linking the murder to the president. Suspicion quickly fell upon Yuan Shikai and his inner circle. To many observers, the timing seemed far too convenient. With Song removed, the strongest defender of parliamentary democracy was gone. Political tensions escalated almost immediately. Members of the Kuomintang demanded a full investigation and accused Yuan of abusing his office. Rather than cooperate, the president moved to strengthen his grip on power. He expanded military control over the government. Opposition leaders were intimidated. Critical newspapers faced increasing censorship. The relationship between the presidency and parliament steadily deteriorated. Eventually, Sun Yat-sen concluded that Yuan had abandoned the principles of the republic altogether. In the summer of 1913, several southern provinces rose in rebellion, hoping to remove Yuan from power. The uprising later became known as the Second Revolution. But the outcome was never truly in doubt. Yuan's Beiyang army remained the strongest military force in China. Its modern weapons, experienced officers, and disciplined troops quickly overwhelmed the scattered revolutionary forces. Province after province surrendered. The rebellion collapsed within weeks. Sun Yat-sen once again fled into exile, this time to Japan. His dream of building a democratic republic had suffered a devastating setback. Meanwhile, Yuan Shikai tightened his control over the nation. The Kuomintang was outlawed. Its elected representatives were expelled from parliament. The National Assembly itself was gradually stripped of meaningful authority. By the end of 1914, constitutional government had effectively ceased to exist. China remained a republic in name. In practice, it had become a military dictatorship dominated by one man. Ironically, Yuan had achieved what neither foreign powers nor the Qing emperors had managed. He had dismantled China's first experiment with democracy from within. Yet, despite concentrating power in his own hands, Yuan proved unable to solve the enormous problems facing the country. Regional commanders continued expanding their personal armies. Government finances remained fragile. Foreign powers still exercised enormous influence over Chinese affairs. The republic had changed its flag, but many of the empire's deepest weaknesses remained untouched. Worse still, Yuan's own ambitions were about to plunge China into an even greater crisis. By late 1915, Yuan Shikai had become convinced that China's greatest need was not democracy, but strong, centralized authority. In his view, the republic had brought only political division, regional rebellions, and endless conflict. Many of his closest advisors encouraged him to believe that only a restored monarchy could reunify the nation. Yuan agreed. In December 1915, he accepted a carefully orchestrated petition urging him to ascend the imperial throne. The Republic of China, barely 4 years old, was officially abolished. Yuan announced the founding of a new imperial dynasty and prepared to crown himself emperor. The decision stunned the country. Many who had supported Yuan against the Qing now viewed him as a traitor to the revolution. Provincial leaders refused to recognize his new regime. Military commanders declared independence from Beijing. Even officers within Yuan's own army questioned his judgment. Instead of restoring stability, his imperial ambitions united his enemies. The first challenge came from Yunnan province. where military leaders openly rejected the new monarchy and declared the beginning of the National Protection War. Other provinces soon followed. One after another, regional governments renounced Yuan's authority. Facing mounting resistance, he discovered a painful truth. The loyalty of many commanders had depended on his position as president, not emperor. His dream of founding a new dynasty collapsed almost as quickly as it had begun. After ruling as emperor for only a few months, Yuan reluctantly abandoned the throne in March 1916. The damage, however, had already been done. His credibility had been destroyed. Support continued to evaporate. Only 3 months later, on June 6, 1916, Yuan Shikai died unexpectedly, reportedly suffering from kidney disease brought on by years of physical exhaustion and overwhelming political stress. His death left China without a strong central government. The republic survived in name. In reality, national authority all but disappeared. What followed became known as the Warlord Era. Across the country, powerful military commanders carved China into competing territories. Each controlled his own army, collected taxes, issued local laws, and governed independently of Beijing. Some ruled through negotiation. Others relied on fear and violence. All claimed to represent the legitimate government. In practice, none possessed the strength to reunify the nation. The central government changed hands repeatedly, but its authority rarely extended far beyond the capital. Alliances formed and collapsed with astonishing speed. Former allies became bitter enemies overnight. Battles erupted over railways, customs revenues, strategic cities, and political influence. For ordinary citizens, daily life became increasingly uncertain. Farmers paid taxes to multiple armies. Merchants faced constant extortion. Entire communities were caught between rival warlords whose shifting front lines turned villages into battlefields. While political chaos consumed the country, another revolution quietly began not on the battlefield, but in China's classrooms and universities. A new generation of intellectuals argued that military victories alone could never save the nation. China, they believed, first had to transform the way its people thought. This movement became known as the New Culture Movement. Its leading scholars challenged centuries-old traditions. They criticized rigid Confucian social structures, promoted scientific reasoning, encouraged individual freedom, and called for greater equality between men and women. Writers abandoned classical literary Chinese in favor of the everyday spoken language, making books and newspapers accessible to millions who had previously been excluded from intellectual life. Universities became centers of passionate debate. Students questioned authority. Professors translated Western philosophy, political theory, economics, and modern science. For the first time, large numbers of young Chinese openly discussed democracy, socialism, liberalism, nationalism, and Marxism. These ideas would profoundly shape China's future. Then came another national humiliation. At the end of the First World War, many Chinese hoped that the victorious Allied powers would finally return Shandong province, which Germany had controlled before the war. China had supported the Allies, expecting that its contribution would be rewarded. Instead, at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, the former German concessions in Shandong were transferred not back to China but to Japan. The decision ignited outrage across the nation. On May 4, 1919, thousands of university students gathered in Beijing to protest. They denounced both the foreign powers and China's own government for failing to defend national interests. The demonstrations spread rapidly. Workers organized strikes. Merchants closed their businesses. Teachers suspended classes. For one of the first times in modern Chinese history, students, workers, intellectuals, and business leaders united in a nationwide political movement. The May 4th movement became far more than a protest. It awakened a new sense of Chinese nationalism. It inspired millions to believe that only profound political and social transformation could restore China's independence and dignity. Among the many ideas debated during this period, one ideology attracted increasing attention: Marxism. The recent Russian Revolution of 1917 had demonstrated that an old empire could be overthrown and replaced by an entirely new political system. Young Chinese intellectuals eagerly studied the writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, searching for answers to their own country's crisis. In July 1921, representatives from several small Marxist study groups secretly gathered in Shanghai. Their meeting was modest. Only a handful of delegates attended, yet the organization they founded would eventually reshape not only China, but the balance of global power. It was called the Chinese Communist Party. Among the delegates was a young librarian from Hunan province. His name was Mao Zedong. At the time, few could have imagined that this quiet intellectual would one day lead one of the greatest revolutions in modern history. China had overthrown its emperors. It had experimented with democracy. It had descended into military fragmentation. Now, a new ideological struggle was beginning, one that would determine the future of the world's most populous nation for generations to come. The birth of the Chinese Communist Party marked the beginning of a new political force, but in the early 1920s, it remained small, fragmented, and vastly outmatched by its rivals. China itself was still divided among competing warlords. The government in Beijing held little real authority beyond the capital, while regional military commanders ruled their territories as personal kingdoms. For both the nationalists and the communists, one objective stood above all others: the reunification of China. At the center of this effort stood Sun Yat-sen. Although he had failed to establish a stable republic, he remained the most respected revolutionary leader in the country. Determined to rebuild the nationalist movement, he reorganized the Kuomintang KMT into a disciplined political party capable of leading a national revolution. But ideals alone would not reunite China. Sun needed an army. Finding little support from the Western powers, he turned instead to the Soviet Union. Moscow saw an opportunity to expand its influence in East Asia. Soviet advisors arrived in southern China, providing financial assistance, military training, and organizational expertise to the nationalists. At the same time, they encouraged cooperation between the Kuomintang and China's Young Communist Party. The result was the first united front, an uneasy alliance between two movements with profoundly different visions for China's future, yet a shared determination to defeat the warlords. To train the officers who would lead this revolution, Sun established the Whampoa Military Academy near Guangzhou. Its commandant was a rising nationalist officer who had studied military affairs in Japan and spent time observing the Soviet Red Army. His name was Chiang Kai-shek. Strict, disciplined, and fiercely anti-communist, Chiang quickly earned a reputation as one of the nationalist movement's most capable military leaders. Yet before the revolution could begin, tragedy struck once again. In March 1925, Sun Yat-sen died after a battle with cancer. His death left the nationalist movement without its founding visionary. A fierce struggle for leadership followed. Among the competing figures, Chiang Kai-shek steadily emerged as the strongest. Unlike many politicians, he possessed something far more decisive: an army loyal to him. By 1926, Chiang was ready to launch the campaign that Sun had long envisioned. It became known as the Northern Expedition. Its objective was nothing less than the reunification of China. Thousands of nationalist soldiers marched north from Guangzhou, determined to destroy the warlord regimes that had dominated the country for nearly a decade. At first, success came with remarkable speed. Several warlord armies collapsed after brief resistance. Others switched sides before major battles could even begin. As the nationalist advance gathered momentum, ordinary citizens increasingly welcomed the prospect of a unified China after years of chaos and civil conflict. Communist organizers accompanied the nationalist armies, mobilizing workers and peasants in support of the campaign. Together, the alliance appeared unstoppable. But beneath the surface, tensions were rapidly growing. Communist influence expanded dramatically inside labor unions, peasant associations, and even within the Kuomintang itself. Too many conservative nationalists. The revolution was beginning to look less like a movement for national unity and more like a pathway to communist revolution. No one viewed this development with greater suspicion than Chiang Kai-shek. Although he had accepted Soviet assistance, he had never trusted the communists. As their power grew, so did his determination to eliminate them. The alliance that had carried the revolution forward was approaching its breaking point. And before long, former allies would become bitter enemies, as the National Revolutionary Army pushed steadily toward the north. The fragile alliance between the nationalists and the communists began to unravel. Military victories had brought the dream of a unified China within reach, but they had also intensified the struggle over who would ultimately control that united nation. Chiang Kai-shek had grown deeply suspicious of his communist allies. The expanding influence of communist organizers among workers, trade unions, and urban activists convinced him that the revolutionary movement was slipping beyond his control. Those fears reached their peak as nationalist forces approached Shanghai. Days before Chiang's army entered the city, communist organizers led by Zhou Enlai coordinated a workers' uprising that succeeded in seizing much of Shanghai before the nationalists arrived. To Chiang, the message was unmistakable. The communists were no longer simply allies in a common revolution. They were becoming rivals for power. Fortunately for Chiang, he possessed influential friends within Shanghai itself. Among them was Du Yusheng, the notorious Green Gang leader whose criminal empire dominated much of the city's underworld. Du was also a trusted ally of Chiang Kai-shek. In the early hours of April 12, 1927, Green Gang gunmen struck first. Communist organizers, labor leaders, and trade union activists were hunted through the streets of Shanghai. When thousands of workers gathered to protest the violence, nationalist troops opened fire. What followed became known as the Shanghai Massacre. It marked one of the defining turning points in modern Chinese history. The bloodshed did not end in Shanghai. Across territories controlled by the Kuomintang, communist members and suspected sympathizers were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. The First United Front had ended not with negotiation, but with bloodshed and betrayal. The Communist Party suddenly found itself fighting for survival. Its response was immediate. Revolutionary leaders attempted to ignite armed uprisings across the country. In Nanchang, Zhou Enlai helped organize an armed revolt against nationalist authority. The following month, Mao Zedong launched the Autumn Harvest Uprising in Hunan and Jiangxi. Later that year, another rebellion erupted in Canton. Each uprising was crushed by nationalist forces. Militarily, the communists suffered disastrous defeats. Politically, however, they drew a profound lesson. Large industrial cities where the party had concentrated much of its effort could not yet sustain a successful revolution. If the movement was to survive, it would have to seek support elsewhere. From this realization, communist strategy began a historic transformation. Rather than relying primarily on urban workers, increasing attention turned toward China's vast rural population. The peasantry, long overlooked by many Marxist revolutionaries, would gradually become the foundation of Mao Zedong's vision for revolution. While the communists struggled to recover, Chiang Kai-shek resumed the northern expedition with renewed determination. His next objective was the last major warlord still standing against nationalist rule. Zhang Zuolin, the powerful ruler of Manchuria. By June 1928, nationalist forces marched triumphantly into Beijing, the old imperial capital. For the first time in years, it appeared that China might finally emerge from the era of warlord fragmentation. Zhang Zuolin withdrew toward Manchuria, where Japanese political and military influence had become increasingly dominant. For years, Japan had supported him as a useful buffer protecting its interests in northeastern China. Now, however, Japanese officers concluded that he had outlived his usefulness. As Zhang traveled north by train, explosives hidden beneath the railway detonated, destroying his carriage and killing him. The assassination had been orchestrated by officers of Japan's Qing army, who hoped to install a more compliant leader in his place. Instead, they achieved the opposite. Zhang's son, Zhang Zuliang, inherited control of Manchuria. Rather than becoming Japan's puppet, the young marshal opened negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek. In July 1928, Zhang formally pledged allegiance to the nationalist government while retaining authority over Manchuria. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, China was once again united under a single national government. One flag flew above the country. One capital claimed national authority. And one man stood at the center of that government, Chiang Kai-shek. The dream that had inspired Sun Yat-sen seemed, at last, within reach. But the appearance of unity concealed deep and dangerous divisions. The civil war between the nationalists and the communists had only just begun. By the summer of 1928, Chiang Kai-shek had accomplished what had seemed impossible only a few years earlier. China was once again united under a single national government. One flag flew over the republic, one capital claimed national authority, and one leader stood at the center of power. Yet the unity Chiang celebrated was far more fragile than it appeared. Many of the regional commanders who had supported the northern expedition remained loyal only so long as it served their own interests. They still commanded enormous private armies, controlled vast territories, and possessed ambitions of their own. Chiang intended to change that. In 1929, he unveiled an ambitious plan to reorganize the National Revolutionary Army. Its strength would be drastically reduced, and the remaining forces would be reorganized under the direct authority of the central government. To Chiang, this was essential if China was ever to become a modern nation. To many of his generals, however, it looked like an attempt to strip them of their power and independence. Several influential commanders quickly formed an alliance against him. China was once again plunged into civil war. The conflict became known as the Central Plains War. It was one of the largest military confrontations in modern Chinese history. Roughly 1 million soldiers took part in the fighting as former allies turned their weapons against one another. The campaign proved far more difficult than Chiang had anticipated. His forces suffered several early setbacks as the anti-Chiang coalition pressed its advantage. But the balance shifted when Zhang Zuliang, the young marshal of Manchuria, declared his support for the nationalist government. His intervention tipped the scales decisively. The coalition collapsed. Chiang emerged victorious. The victory came at an enormous cost. Thousands had been killed. Government finances were severely strained. The country's infrastructure suffered further destruction after years of nearly continuous warfare. Even so, Chiang had accomplished something few Chinese leaders had managed in decades. His authority over the nationalist government was now stronger than ever. With his rivals defeated, Chiang established a one-party government in Nanjing, the former capital of the Qing Dynasty. The years that followed became known as the Nanjing Decade. To many observers, this appeared to mark the beginning of a new chapter in Chinese history. The nationalist government introduced legal reforms. Education expanded rapidly. New universities opened across the country. Modern roads, railways, and communication networks linked growing industrial cities. Factories multiplied. Banks expanded. Foreign investment poured into China's economy, particularly from Japan and Western businesses. In the cities, signs of modernization were everywhere. Newspapers flourished. Motion picture theaters attracted growing audiences. Electric lighting transformed urban streets. For the first time in generations, many Chinese believed their country was finally beginning to catch up with the industrial powers of the world. Chiang also sought to reshape Chinese society through ideology. Rejecting communism while embracing modernization, he launched the New Life movement, an effort to combine traditional Confucian morality with modern discipline and national unity. His wife, Soong-Emi Eiling, educated in the United States and fluent in English, became one of the movement's most visible advocates. She represented a new image of China to the outside world: modern, educated, and internationally connected. Yet beneath the surface, serious problems remained unresolved. Despite impressive progress in cities such as Nanjing and Shanghai, the overwhelming majority of Chinese still lived in the countryside. Nearly 85% of the population were peasants. Most saw little improvement in their daily lives. Heavy rents, poor harvests, exhausted farmland, and chronic poverty continued to dominate rural China. For millions of farming families, the promises of the nationalist government felt distant and abstract. This growing divide between prosperous cities and impoverished villages created an opportunity for Chiang's greatest remaining enemy, the communists. Driven from the major cities after the Shanghai massacre, communist leaders abandoned the urban strategy that had brought them repeated defeats. Instead, they turned toward the countryside. There, among China's poorest peasants, they began patiently rebuilding their movement. Far from the attention of the nationalist government, Mao Zedong was developing a revolutionary strategy unlike any attempted before. It would soon transform the future of China. While Chiang Kai-shek sought to modernize the republic, the Chinese communists were rebuilding in the countryside. Only around 10,000 party members had survived the brutal purges of 1927. Driven from the major cities, they established a series of isolated revolutionary bases in remote rural regions. The largest and most successful of these became known as the Jiangxi Soviet. At its head stood Mao Zedong. The son of a prosperous farmer and one of the Communist Party's founding members, Mao envisioned Jiangxi as far more than a temporary refuge. It was to become a model for China's future. Within its borders, the Communists established their own administration, courts, tax system, currency, and even a state bank. More than 3 million people lived under its authority, making it the largest revolutionary enclave in the country. The Jiangxi Soviet also became a laboratory for communist policies. Land was confiscated from wealthy landlords and redistributed to poor peasants. Local governments were reorganized under party control. Political education became an essential part of everyday life. To many impoverished farmers, these reforms offered hope after generations of exploitation. Yet life inside the Soviet was far from peaceful. Internal struggles for power divided the communist leadership. Mao's harsh methods and political purges drew criticism from several senior party figures, causing him to lose influence within the military leadership for a time. Command responsibilities increasingly shifted toward other communist commanders, including Zhou Enlai. For Chiang Kai-shek, however, internal communist disagreements changed nothing. The Jiangxi Soviet represented an intolerable threat. As long as it survived, the nationalist government could never claim to have truly unified China. Determined to eliminate it once and for all, Chiang launched a series of military offensives known as the encirclement campaigns. The strategy was straightforward: surround the communist base, cut off supplies, and gradually destroy the Red Army. The first campaign ended in failure. So did the second, then the third, and the fourth. Using superior knowledge of the terrain and highly mobile guerrilla tactics, communist forces repeatedly avoided decisive battles while inflicting heavy losses on their attackers. The conflict grew increasingly brutal. Entire villages became battlegrounds. Civilians, most of them poor peasants, found themselves trapped between two uncompromising armies. Executions, torture, and reprisals became common as each side sought to eliminate suspected collaborators. Among the victims was Mao Zedong's wife, who was captured by nationalist forces and executed after refusing to denounce her husband. The total death toll during this phase of the Civil War may have reached 500,000 people. Having failed 4 times, Chiang prepared a dramatically different strategy. In September 1934, he assembled nearly 1 million troops for a fifth and final encirclement campaign. Instead of relying on rapid assaults, nationalist forces advanced slowly, constructing fortified blockhouses that steadily tightened the ring around the communist base. Roads were sealed, supply routes disappeared. The Red Army found itself increasingly isolated. This time, guerrilla tactics were no longer enough. After months of relentless pressure, communist territories shrank to a small region around Ruijin. With defeat becoming inevitable, the party leadership faced a momentous decision: remain in Jiangxi and risk annihilation, or abandon the base and preserve the revolution. They chose survival. In October 1934, roughly 100,000 soldiers, officials, and civilians slipped through nationalist lines under cover of darkness. Many were killed during the breakout. Those who escaped began one of the most extraordinary military retreats in modern history. It would later become known as the Long March. For the next year, the exhausted column crossed some of China's most unforgiving landscapes. Towering mountain ranges, treacherous rivers, frozen grasslands, barren plateaus. Every step brought new hardships. Nationalist troops pursued relentlessly. Food was desperately scarce. Disease and exhaustion claimed countless lives, yet the survivors pressed on. By the time the march finally reached Yan'an in northern China, fewer than 1 in 10 of those who had left Jiangxi remained. The journey had covered nearly 6,000 miles, making it one of the longest strategic withdrawals in military history. Militarily, the Long March was a retreat. Politically, it became something far greater. It forged a powerful revolutionary myth that would define the identity of the Chinese Communist Party for generations. During the march, Mao Zedong consolidated his leadership, gradually eclipsing rivals who favored closer adherence to Soviet direction. From this point onward, the party increasingly followed Mao's own revolutionary vision, rather than instructions from Moscow. The communists had lost territory. They had lost most of their army, and they remained on the run. To outside observers, their movement seemed on the verge of extinction. But history was about to take an unexpected turn. An external threat would soon force bitter enemies to stand side by side. By the end of 1936, the Chinese Communist Party appeared to be fighting for its very survival. The Long March had reduced the Red Army to a fraction of its former strength. Its surviving leaders had established a new base around Yan'an, deep in the rugged hills of northern China. Chiang Kai-shek saw an opportunity to finish what he had started. He ordered his commanders to continue the campaign against the communists, convinced that eliminating them remained China's highest priority. Not everyone agreed. Among those who opposed Chiang's strategy was Zhang Zuliang, the young marshal. His bitterness toward Japan ran deep. 8 years earlier, Japanese officers had orchestrated the assassination of his father. In 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria, forcing Jiang's army to retreat from his homeland. To him, the real enemy was obvious. It was not the communists. It was Japan. In December 1936, Chiang traveled to Xi'an to inspect nationalist forces stationed near the communist base. He expected to discuss military operations. Instead, he found himself at the center of one of the most extraordinary political crises in modern Chinese history. Before dawn, Zhang Zuliang's troops surrounded Chiang's residence. Gunfire echoed through the hills as the nationalist leader fled into the surrounding mountains. He was soon captured. China's head of state had become a prisoner of his own general. Zhang presented Chiang with a simple demand: end the civil war. Join forces with the communists. Fight Japan instead. For nearly 2 weeks, tense negotiations followed. Representing the Communist Party, Zhou Enlai met Chiang face to face, a remarkable encounter between men who had stood on opposite sides of a bloody civil war. The discussions were difficult. Distrust remained profound. Yet both sides recognized an uncomfortable truth. If China continued fighting itself, Japan would only grow stronger. At last, Chiang agreed. He promised to suspend the civil war and unite with the communists against the Japanese threat. Only then was he released. True to his character, Chiang acted immediately upon returning to Nanjing. Zhang Zuliang, the very man who had forced the agreement, was placed under house arrest. He would spend decades in captivity. But despite punishing Zhang personally, Chiang honored the agreement itself. The Second United Front was formed. For the second time in history, the nationalists and the communists became uneasy allies. Neither side trusted the other. Both understood that their cooperation might be temporary. Yet for the moment, national survival outweighed ideological rivalry. Only months later, events would test that fragile alliance. On the night of July 7, 1937, Japanese troops stationed near the Marco Polo Bridge, southwest of Beijing, requested permission to enter the nearby walled town of Wamping while searching for a missing soldier. The Chinese garrison refused. Tempers flared. Then, suddenly, a shot rang out. Within moments, both sides were exchanging fire. What began as a localized confrontation quickly spiraled beyond anyone's control. Japanese reinforcements poured into northern China. Chinese troops mobilized in response. Diplomatic efforts failed. The Marco Polo Bridge incident had become the spark that ignited a full-scale war. Many historians regard this moment, not 1939 in Europe, as the true beginning of the Second World War in Asia. 10 days after the incident, Chiang Kai-shek addressed the nation. He warned that China had reached what he called the limit of endurance. If that limit had indeed been crossed, he declared, there could be only one path forward: to sacrifice everything and fight until victory or destruction. Across China, patriotic feeling surged. A stirring new song captured the nation's determination. It was called March of the Volunteers. Decades later, it would become the national anthem of the People's Republic of China. The war had begun, and before long, it would consume millions of lives, devastate entire cities, and reshape the course of modern Chinese history. The fighting that began at the Marco Polo Bridge quickly spread across northern China. Within weeks, Japanese forces had captured a broad swath of territory, including the old imperial capital of Beijing. Despite determined resistance, the National Revolutionary Army struggled against an enemy that possessed superior training, modern equipment, overwhelming air power, and greater battlefield experience. Yet Chiang Kai-shek refused to surrender China's most important commercial center without a fight. His attention turned to Shanghai. At the time, Shanghai was not only China's largest city, but also its financial and cultural heart. Its international settlement, administered jointly by 14 foreign powers, had become a symbol of foreign influence in China. Japan already maintained a substantial civilian community there, supported by thousands of Marines and a powerful naval presence anchored along the Huangpu River. Chiang believed Shanghai offered a unique opportunity. By forcing the Japanese to fight in front of foreign journalists, diplomats, and businessmen, he hoped to expose Japan's aggression to the world while drawing enemy forces away from their offensive in northern China. On August 13, 1937, Chinese troops launched coordinated attacks against Japanese positions in Shanghai. Japan responded immediately. Reinforcements poured into the city by land and sea. What followed became one of the largest and bloodiest urban battles of the early Second World War. Over the next 3 months, nearly 1 million soldiers from both sides fought block by block through factories, warehouses, apartment buildings, and narrow city streets. Artillery shattered entire neighborhoods. Aircraft bombed crowded districts. Tanks rumbled through avenues once filled with shoppers and street vendors. Poison gas attacks added yet another layer of horror to the battlefield. Among the hardest-hit units were Chiang's elite German-trained divisions. Carefully prepared over many years, these troops represented some of the best soldiers the nationalist government possessed. By the end of October, they had suffered devastating losses. Recognizing that the city could no longer be held, Chiang ordered a general withdrawal. One final force remained behind. A single battalion occupied the Xinhai warehouse, transforming the massive concrete building into a fortress. Outnumbered and surrounded, its defenders resisted repeated Japanese assaults for 6 days, buying precious time for the rest of the National Revolutionary Army to retreat. Their stand became a powerful symbol of Chinese resistance. Just across the river, foreign observers watched the battle unfold from the safety of the international settlement. Their photographs, newspaper reports, and film footage quickly spread around the world, dramatically shifting international opinion against Japan. But Shanghai's fall was only the beginning. Japanese forces pursued the retreating Chinese army westward toward the nationalist capital, Nanjing. After a fierce 4-day battle, Japanese troops entered the city on December 13, 1937. A small group of Western residents organized an international safety zone, providing refuge for themselves and a portion of the civilian population. Most of the city's inhabitants, however, had nowhere to escape. What followed became one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. For approximately 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers carried out widespread looting, torture, rape, and mass killings across the city. The precise death toll remains disputed, but estimates cited in the source range from 50,000 to 300,000 civilians. Around 30,000 Chinese prisoners of war were executed in mass shootings. Others were beheaded, buried alive, or used in bayonet practice. Corpses filled the streets before being burned or dumped into the Yangtze River. The international safety zone was administered by the German businessman John Robb, a member of the Nazi Party. Despite his political affiliation, Robb was horrified by the atrocities he witnessed. He repeatedly appealed for intervention, hoping Germany's relationship with Japan might help restrain the violence. Instead, Germany concluded that Japan had become the stronger strategic partner. Berlin gradually ended its military support for Chiang Kai-shek's government, leaving China even more isolated. The atrocities in Nanjing shocked observers around the world. The United States and the League of Nations condemned the violence, yet condemnation was not matched by meaningful military action. For China, the massacre became a lasting symbol of national suffering. For Japan's campaign in China, it marked the beginning of a pattern in which atrocities against civilians became an increasingly common feature of the war. Even after capturing the nationalist capital, however, Japan had not broken Chinese resistance. The nationalist government retreated inland. The war was far from over. The fall of Nanjing did not end China's resistance. Instead, the Japanese high command prepared for another major offensive. Their next objective was the strategic city of Wuhan, an important industrial center and transportation hub where the nationalist government had temporarily relocated many of its institutions after abandoning Nanjing. Chinese forces fought stubbornly to slow the Japanese advance. One of their few notable successes came during the Battle of Tairzhuang, where nationalist troops inflicted a rare and highly celebrated defeat on the invading army. The victory lifted morale across the country and demonstrated that Japan was not invincible, yet it proved insufficient to alter the overall course of the campaign. As Japanese columns continued pressing toward Wuhan, Chiang Kai-shek's government resorted to one of the most desperate decisions in modern Chinese history. Orders were issued to destroy the dikes holding back the Yellow River near Huaihuankou. Military planners hoped the resulting flood would halt the Japanese advance and buy precious time for China's exhausted defenders. The consequences were catastrophic. In June 1938, vast torrents of water burst across the densely populated North China Plain. Entire villages disappeared beneath the floodwaters. Farmland was devastated. Millions of people lost their homes almost overnight. According to the source material, approximately 500,000 civilians died, while around 5 million were displaced. The destruction of fertile agricultural land would contribute to famine and hardship for years afterward. It remains one of the greatest man-made disasters ever inflicted by a government upon its own people. Yet even this extraordinary sacrifice failed to achieve its intended purpose. Rather than forcing their way through the flooded region, Japanese forces simply bypassed the affected areas and continued their advance. The road to Wuhan remained open. By the time the opposing armies met outside the city, the scale of the conflict had become immense. Nearly 2 million soldiers were engaged in what became one of the largest battles fought anywhere in Asia before the wider Second World War. For 4 months, Chinese and Japanese troops battled across rivers, hills, and fortified defensive lines. Chinese resistance was fierce. But once again, Japanese superiority in the air, combined with coordinated infantry tactics and the extensive use of poison gas, gradually turned the tide of the campaign. After 4 months of relentless fighting, Wuhan fell. The nationalist government was forced to retreat once again, moving roughly 500 miles farther inland to Chongqing, deep within the mountainous province of Sichuan. From there, Chiang Kai-shek prepared to continue the war despite losing many of China's greatest cities. Japan now occupied much of China's eastern seaboard and established a new puppet government in Nanjing, hoping to legitimize its conquest through collaboration. On paper, Tokyo appeared closer than ever to victory. Reality, however, told a different story. Years of continuous campaigning had exhausted the Imperial Japanese Army. Its supply lines stretched across enormous distances. Holding conquered territory required hundreds of thousands of troops, leaving little strength for another decisive offensive. China, though battered and divided, refused to surrender. The conflict settled into a brutal war of attrition. Historians generally refer to it as the Second Sino-Japanese War. In China, it became known simply as the War of Resistance. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. And soon, the struggle in China would become inseparable from an even greater global conflict. By 1939, China's position had become increasingly precarious. After years of relentless war, the Soviet Union remained the nationalist government's only major foreign supporter. Soviet aircraft, military advisors, and supplies played a vital role in keeping China's war effort alive. While Soviet pilots formed a large part of the nationalist air force, but events in Europe soon changed everything. With another global conflict on the horizon, Joseph Stalin chose to reduce the immediate threat on the Soviet Union's eastern frontier. In September 1939, Moscow reached a truce with Japan. Just 2 days later, Soviet forces entered Poland alongside Nazi Germany, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the European War. For China, the consequences were severe. Its most important foreign ally had effectively stepped back from the conflict. Despite this setback, the nationalist government refused to surrender. From its wartime capital in Chongqing, Chiang Kai-shek continued directing the struggle against Japanese occupation. The city soon became one of the most heavily bombed places on Earth. Over the following years, Japanese aircraft carried out more than 200 air raids, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble while civilians sought shelter beneath the city's rocky hillsides. Far to the north, communist forces pursued a very different strategy. Rather than confronting the Japanese in large conventional battles, they relied on coordinated guerrilla warfare. Small, mobile units attacked railway lines, supply depots, isolated garrisons, and communication networks before disappearing back into the countryside. Although the nationalists and communists remained nominal allies against Japan, their cooperation had once again begun to unravel. Mutual suspicion steadily replaced the fragile unity created after the Xi'an incident. Each side increasingly viewed the other not as a partner, but as the rival that would dominate China once the war ended. Meanwhile, the nationalist government searched desperately for new supply routes. With Soviet assistance diminishing, increasing quantities of weapons, fuel, and ammunition entered China through French Indochina, today's Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. For Japan, that lifeline had to be cut. In 1940, Japanese forces occupied French Indochina, extending their military presence deep into Southeast Asia and severing one of China's last major supply corridors. The occupation alarmed the Western colonial powers. British possessions in Malaya and Singapore, Dutch territories in the East Indies, and American interests throughout the Pacific suddenly appeared vulnerable. In response, the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands imposed a sweeping oil embargo against Japan. Without imported oil, Japan's economy and its military campaign in China faced an uncertain future. The Western governments hoped economic pressure would force Tokyo to reconsider its expansionist ambitions. Instead, Japan made a far more dangerous choice. Its leaders concluded that if war with the Western powers had become unavoidable, it would be better to strike first. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft launched a surprise attack against the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. At almost the same moment, Japanese forces attacked American and British positions across Southeast Asia. Within weeks, they captured Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the resource-rich Dutch East Indies in one of the most rapid military offensives of the Second World War. Japan had dramatically expanded the conflict. What had begun as a regional war in China was now inseparable from a truly global struggle. And for China, the entry of the United States into the war would transform the balance of power once again. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the strategic balance of the war. What had once been a desperate struggle fought largely in isolation was now part of a global conflict. For China, the entrance of the United States into the war brought renewed hope. American industry mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Within a single year, factories across the United States were producing more aircraft, ships, vehicles, and weapons than all the Axis powers combined. China became one of the beneficiaries of this extraordinary industrial effort. Through the Lend-Lease program, the nationalist government received more than $5 billion worth of military equipment, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies. Yet delivering those supplies proved enormously difficult. When Japanese forces captured Burma, China's last overland supply route was severed. With no safe roads remaining, Allied transport aircraft were forced to fly from India across the towering Himalayas. American pilots gave this hazardous route a fitting nickname, the Hump. Treacherous weather, violent turbulence, and the thin mountain air made every mission a gamble. Hundreds of aircraft were lost carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and medicine to China's embattled defenders. Even so, the airlift became one of the greatest logistical achievements of the Second World War. American assistance extended beyond equipment. President Roosevelt appointed General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell as his chief military representative in China, an experienced and outspoken officer. Stilwell believed the Nationalist Army could become an effective fighting force, but only through sweeping reform. Unfortunately, his relationship with Chiang Kai-shek deteriorated almost immediately. Stilwell regarded Chiang as stubborn, inefficient, and unwilling to commit his best troops to battle. Chiang, in turn, considered Stilwell arrogant, overbearing, and insensitive to China's political realities. Their mutual distrust would become one of the greatest obstacles to Allied cooperation in the China theater. Another symbol of American support soon captured the imagination of the Chinese people. Under the command of Major General Claire Chennault, a volunteer group of American fighter pilots arrived to help defend China's skies. They became famous as the Flying Tigers, flying shark-faced fighter aircraft. The squadron quickly earned a formidable reputation by shooting down large numbers of Japanese aircraft while protecting Chinese cities and vital supply routes. As the war continued, additional American air units arrived, and a network of new airfields was constructed across southern China to support expanding Allied operations. China's international standing also rose dramatically. It was now recognized as one of the four great Allied powers, alongside the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. In November 1943, Chiang Kai-shek traveled to Cairo, Egypt, where he met with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill to discuss the future of the war in Asia. Chinese resistance had already tied down nearly 1 million Japanese soldiers, preventing them from being deployed elsewhere across the Pacific. The Western leaders praised China's sacrifices and promised continued assistance. Behind closed doors, however, neither Washington nor London regarded China as their highest strategic priority. The decisive battles, in their view, would be fought elsewhere. Meanwhile, conditions inside China continued to deteriorate. Years of warfare had devastated industry. Inflation spiraled out of control. Government corruption became increasingly widespread. The nationalist administration struggled to pay its soldiers, and desertion steadily increased. While Allied support offered hope, it could not erase the enormous economic and political problems that had accumulated after years of relentless conflict. Japan recognized these growing weaknesses. Despite suffering setbacks across the Pacific, its military leadership believed one final decisive campaign in China might still change the course of the war. In April 1944, Japan launched its largest offensive of the entire conflict. The operation carried the coded name Operation Ichigo. Its objectives were ambitious: to establish a continuous land corridor linking northern China with French Indochina, to capture the American air bases in southern China that supported bombing raids against the Japanese home islands, and to deliver a crushing blow to Chiang Kai-shek's already exhausted army. The offensive struck with overwhelming force. Weakened nationalist defenses crumbled under the assault. Several key American airfields were overrun. By October 1944, Japanese forces had successfully linked their occupied territories from North China to Indochina. Once again, the Chinese army suffered devastating losses. The defeat further damaged Chiang Kai-shek's reputation both at home and abroad. Relations with General Stilwell reached a breaking point when the American commander demanded direct operational control over all Chinese forces. Chiang flatly refused. Instead, he persuaded President Roosevelt to recall Stilwell from China. Although Chiang had won the political battle, American confidence in his leadership was steadily eroding. At the same time, many foreign observers began drawing an uncomfortable comparison. While the nationalist government struggled with corruption, inflation, and military setbacks, the Chinese Communist forces in the north continued expanding their influence through disciplined guerrilla warfare and effective rural organization. Yet, despite its impressive gains, Operation Ichigo came too late. Japan's position across the wider Pacific was already collapsing. No victory in China could reverse the overwhelming industrial and military power now arrayed against the Japanese Empire. By the beginning of 1945, the tide of war had turned decisively against Japan. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces were retreating on every front. Their navy had been shattered, their merchant fleet devastated, and Allied bombers now struck the Japanese home islands with increasing intensity. China, despite 8 years of invasion and unimaginable suffering, remained in the fight. The last major Japanese offensive on Chinese soil was finally brought to a halt. Nationalist forces, supported by growing Allied resources, launched a series of counteroffensives that gradually reclaimed lost territory. For the first time in years, Japanese troops were being forced onto the defensive. Yet the decisive blows would not fall in China. They would come from elsewhere. Throughout the summer of 1945, American strategic bombing intensified against Japan's industrial cities, crippling its ability to continue the war. Then, in August 1945, the conflict entered an entirely new and terrifying chapter. The United States dropped the world's first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Never before had humanity witnessed weapons capable of such instantaneous devastation. At almost the same moment, another long-feared enemy entered the war. Honoring commitments made to the Allied powers, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. Veteran Soviet armies swept across northeastern China with overwhelming speed, crushing the Japanese Kwantung Army, once regarded as one of Japan's most formidable military formations. Within days, Japan's strategic position had become hopeless. Facing defeat on every front, Emperor Hirohito made an unprecedented decision. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard the emperor's own voice over the radio. He announced that Japan would accept the Allied terms of surrender. The Second World War had come to an end. For China, victory brought celebration, but not peace. The Japanese occupation had claimed millions of lives. Entire cities had been reduced to ruins. Industry lay devastated. Transportation networks had collapsed. Countless families had been displaced after years of relentless warfare. China had survived the invasion, but the nation remained exhausted, impoverished, and deeply divided. The common enemy that had temporarily united the nationalists and communists had disappeared. Almost immediately, old rivalries resurfaced. Both sides raced to occupy the territories abandoned by Japanese forces. In Manchuria, Soviet troops took control of enormous quantities of Japanese weapons and military equipment before gradually withdrawing. The region quickly became the most strategically important prize in post-war China. Each side understood that whoever controlled Manchuria would possess a decisive advantage in the struggle ahead. The fragile cooperation forged during the war rapidly collapsed. Negotiations were attempted. Mutual accusations followed. Trust evaporated. China stood once again on the brink of civil war. This time, however, the conflict would determine not merely who governed the country, but what kind of nation China would become. Would the future belong to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist republic or to Mao Zedong's communist revolution? The answer would reshape not only China, but the entire 20th century. Japan's surrender ended one war. It also cleared the way for another. With the common enemy defeated, the fragile partnership between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists collapsed almost immediately. Both sides raced to occupy territory abandoned by the Japanese. Nowhere was more important than Manchuria. Rich in industry, railways, and natural resources, it represented the greatest strategic prize in post-war China. As Soviet forces dismantled Japanese control across the region, they captured enormous stockpiles of weapons, vehicles, artillery, and ammunition. When the Red Army gradually withdrew, much of this equipment became available to the Chinese communists, dramatically strengthening their military position. The United States desperately hoped to prevent another civil war. American diplomats attempted to broker a political settlement between the nationalists and the communists. For a brief moment, negotiations appeared promising. Delegations met. Agreements were drafted. Both sides publicly expressed support for peace. Behind closed doors, however, neither trusted the other. Each believed military victory remained possible. By the summer of 1946, negotiations had collapsed. China was once again engulfed by civil war. At first, Chiang Kai-shek appeared to hold every advantage. The nationalist government enjoyed international recognition. It possessed a larger army, superior heavy weapons, an established air force, and significant American military assistance. Most major cities remained under nationalist control. Many foreign observers predicted that communist resistance would soon be crushed. Instead, the opposite occurred. Rather than defending every town and city, communist commanders relied on mobility, surprise, and careful concentration of force. Under the brilliant military leadership of Lin Biao, communist armies gradually expanded their influence across the countryside while avoiding battles that favored nationalist firepower. Meanwhile, the nationalist government struggled with mounting problems. Years of war had devastated the economy. Inflation spiraled out of control. Government corruption became increasingly visible. Food shortages worsened. Public confidence steadily declined. Even many nationalist soldiers questioned the leadership they were fighting for. By contrast, communist forces emphasized strict discipline. Land reform programs won growing support among poor peasants. New recruits flowed steadily into the People's Liberation Army, transforming it from a guerrilla movement into a powerful conventional army capable of confronting nationalist forces on equal terms. The balance of the war was beginning to shift. What had started as another attempt to eliminate the communist movement was rapidly becoming a struggle for the future of all China. By 1948, the balance of the Chinese Civil War had shifted dramatically. Only 2 years earlier, Chiang Kai-shek's armies had seemed destined for victory. Now, the momentum belonged to the communists. The People's Liberation Army, reorganized under Lin Biao and strengthened by a steady flow of recruits from the countryside, had evolved into a disciplined conventional force capable of confronting the nationalists head-on. Mao believed the time for guerrilla warfare was over. The revolution would now be decided through large-scale campaigns designed to destroy the nationalist army once and for all. In September 1948, the Communists launched the first of 3 decisive offensives that would determine the outcome of the war. The campaign unfolded in Manchuria. Under Lin Biao's command, Communist forces systematically isolated nationalist garrisons, severed railway connections, and surrounded major cities. One after another, nationalist strongholds fell. Attempts to reinforce or evacuate trapped troops ended in disaster. By the conclusion of the campaign, more than 400,000 nationalist soldiers had been lost. Only about 150,000 managed to escape south. For Chiang Kai-shek, the defeat was catastrophic. Manchuria, China's most heavily industrialized region, had been lost. The Communists wasted no time exploiting their success. The following month, they launched major offensives simultaneously across northern China. After fierce fighting, key cities including Tianjin and Suzhou fell into communist hands. Nationalist resistance crumbled under relentless pressure. According to the source material, the nationalists suffered another 500,000 casualties, while also losing much of their remaining heavy equipment and supplies. The winter of 1948-1949 proved devastating for Chiang Kai-shek's government. In the span of only 4 months, the Communists had achieved 3 decisive victories, driving nationalist forces from nearly all of northern China. The military balance had been transformed beyond recognition. Across the south, the nationalist administration began to unravel. Government authority weakened, law and order deteriorated, economic collapse accelerated, hyperinflation rendered savings almost worthless, while corruption further eroded public confidence in the regime. Even many nationalist officers no longer believed victory was possible. As communist armies advanced southward, resistance weakened with each passing week. In April 1949, they crossed the Yangtze River and captured Nanjing, the capital of the Republic of China. The fall of the city carried enormous symbolic weight. It marked the collapse of Chiang Kai-shek's authority on the mainland. Only weeks later, communist forces entered Shanghai, China's largest commercial and financial center. After years of war, one city after another came under communist control. For Mao Zedong, decades of revolution, hardship, and struggle had led to this moment. On October 1st, 1949, before an immense crowd gathered in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. A new state had been born, a new era in Chinese history had begun. Yet victory on the mainland did not bring an immediate end to the conflict. Nationalist forces continued withdrawing toward China's southeastern coast. The final chapter of the Civil War was still unfolding. The communist victory on the mainland marked the end of one era, but not the end of the Chinese Civil War. As communist armies swept across the country, Chiang Kai-shek, accompanied by roughly 2 million nationalist soldiers, government officials, and refugees, withdrew across the Taiwan Strait to the island of Taiwan, one of the last territories still under nationalist control. He would never again set foot on mainland China. For Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, the victory represented the culmination of decades of revolution, sacrifice, and war. For the first time in modern history, they possessed complete control over mainland China, yet the triumph came at an enormous cost. Years of invasion, civil conflict, famine, and political upheaval had left the nation economically devastated. Entire cities lay in ruins. Railways and factories had been destroyed. Agricultural production had collapsed across many regions. Millions of families had been displaced by nearly 2 decades of uninterrupted warfare. Winning the revolution had been only the first challenge. Now came the far greater task, rebuilding China itself. On October 1st, 1949, standing atop Tiananmen Gate in Beijing, Mao formally proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The ceremony marked more than the birth of a new state. It signaled the beginning of an entirely new political order. Mao declared that the Chinese people had finally stood up. For his supporters, the proclamation fulfilled a revolutionary struggle that had begun decades earlier. For his opponents, it marked the beginning of communist rule over one of the world's oldest civilizations. The new government described itself as a people's democratic dictatorship. In practice, however, political authority rested firmly in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. At the heart of the system stood the Central Committee, composed of the party's senior leadership. Above it sat the Politburo. And within that body, an even smaller Politburo Standing Committee exercised the highest decision-making authority in the country. Several veteran revolutionaries now occupied the most influential positions in the new state. Liu Shaoqi, a longtime party organizer who had studied in Moscow, became one of Mao's closest political allies. Zhou Enlai, respected for his diplomatic skill and unwavering loyalty throughout the revolutionary years, assumed the roles of premier and foreign minister, becoming the chief architect of China's domestic administration and international diplomacy. Above them all stood Mao Zedong. At 55 years old, he now wielded greater personal authority than any Chinese leader since the Imperial era. Although never known as a powerful public speaker, Mao possessed extraordinary political instincts, intellectual confidence, and an ability to inspire unwavering devotion among his followers. His leadership during both the Anti-Japanese War and the Civil War had elevated him to an almost legendary status within the party. Beside him stood his fourth wife, Jiang Qing. A former actress with a forceful personality, she was fiercely loyal to Mao and deeply hostile toward anyone she regarded as a political rival. Although her influence remained limited in the early years of the People's Republic, she would later become one of the most controversial figures in modern Chinese history. The revolution had succeeded. The People's Republic had been born, but after decades of destruction, China faced an immense challenge. The new communist leadership had to transform an impoverished, overwhelmingly rural nation into a stable and modern state. A mission that would shape China's future for generations to come. The proclamation of the People's Republic of China marked the beginning of a new political era. But after decades of war, revolution, and foreign invasion, victory alone could not rebuild the nation. China remained overwhelmingly rural. Industry was weak. Transportation networks had been devastated. Millions of people had lost their homes, while inflation and economic disruption continued to burden daily life. For Mao Zedong and the Communist Party, consolidating power and transforming society became the next great challenge. The new leadership moved quickly. Across the countryside, the government launched an ambitious land reform program aimed at dismantling the traditional landlord system that had dominated rural China for centuries. Large estates were confiscated and redistributed to poor peasants. For countless farming families, it was the first time they had ever owned the land they cultivated. The reforms dramatically expanded communist support throughout rural China and strengthened the party's authority in villages across the country. At the same time, the communist leadership sought to eliminate any remaining political opposition. Former nationalist officials, suspected counter-revolutionaries, and individuals considered hostile to the new government faced arrest, imprisonment, or public trials. The party argued that such campaigns were necessary to secure the revolution and prevent any attempt to restore the old order. By the early 1950s, communist authority extended across virtually every level of Chinese society. Abroad, the People's Republic looked to its largest ideological ally. The Soviet Union became China's principal international partner. Soviet engineers, advisors, and economic planners arrived to help rebuild the country's shattered economy. The alliance provided technical expertise, industrial equipment, financial assistance, and a model for centralized economic planning that would shape China's early development. The new government also began transforming the structure of the economy. Banks, major industries, railways, and key infrastructure gradually came under state control. Private enterprises faced increasing regulation as Beijing expanded its influence over production, investment, and trade. The objective was clear: to replace the fragmented economy inherited from decades of war with a centrally planned socialist system capable of rapid industrialization. Yet, before these ambitious plans could fully take shape, events beyond China's borders demanded immediate attention. On the Korean Peninsula, tensions between North and South were rapidly escalating. Within months, China would once again find itself at war. The conflict would test the strength of the new People's Republic, reshape its relationship with the United States, and firmly establish Communist China as a major force in international affairs. The People's Republic had been founded. The Civil War had been won. Yet Mao Zedong understood that military victory alone would not secure China's future. The new state faced enormous challenges: an economy devastated by decades of conflict, widespread poverty, and the daunting task of consolidating communist rule across one of the world's largest countries. Even as Reconstruction began, events beyond China's borders demanded immediate attention. In February 1950, Mao traveled to Moscow, where he signed the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance with the Soviet Union. The agreement unlocked extensive economic cooperation, military assistance, and Soviet technical expertise, providing the young People's Republic with an invaluable partner during its formative years. At the same time, Beijing moved to reassert central authority over territories that had slipped from Chinese control during the collapse of the Qing Dynasty. The People's Liberation Army entered Xinjiang in 1949. 2 years later, Chinese forces occupied and annexed Tibet, an operation officially described by the government as the peaceful liberation of Tibet. Under the agreement that followed, the Dalai Lama remained at the head of the local administration, while Outer Mongolia remained outside Chinese control within the Soviet sphere of influence. Meanwhile, Taiwan continued to be claimed by both governments, each denouncing the other as illegitimate. Before the new government could fully focus on rebuilding the nation, another war erupted. After the Second World War, the Korean Peninsula had been divided into two rival states: a communist North and a democratic South. In June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, rapidly overrunning much of the south and capturing Seoul within days. Under American leadership, United Nations forces intervened, driving the North Korean army back toward the Yalu River, which marked the border between Korea and China. To Mao, the advancing UN forces represented an unacceptable threat. Fearing that an American-backed army might soon stand directly on China's frontier and determined to preserve a fellow communist state, he ordered Chinese troops into Korea. More than 1 million Chinese soldiers initially entered the conflict, with the total eventually rising to approximately 5 million. Their massive intervention forced UN forces into a rapid retreat and transformed the course of the war. Months of bitter fighting followed. Neither side could secure a decisive victory. The front gradually stabilized once again along the 38th parallel, where entrenched armies faced one another across fortified positions. In 1953, an armistice ended the fighting, establishing the heavily defended Demilitarized Zone (DMZ) that continues to separate North and South Korea today. Within China, the Korean War was portrayed as a historic success. The communist government celebrated its ability to confront the world's most powerful military coalition and defend the socialist cause. The conflict also strengthened the party's domestic legitimacy, reinforcing the image of Mao as the leader who had restored China's national dignity. But victory came at a terrible price. The Korean War claimed an estimated 3 million lives. Chinese military casualties exceeded 500,000, and among the dead was Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong's eldest son, who was killed during a United Nations airstrike while serving with Chinese forces. The war also reshaped China's relationship with the outside world. The United States imposed a comprehensive trade embargo on communist China, while dramatically strengthening its commitment to Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan. President Harry Truman ordered the U.S. 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait, effectively preventing any immediate communist attempt to invade the island. The Chinese Civil War had ended on the mainland, but across the Taiwan Strait, its political legacy would endure for decades to come. The armistice in Korea gave the People's Republic its first opportunity to focus fully on rebuilding the nation. In 1953, the communist government introduced its first 5-year plan, modeled closely on the Soviet system of centralized economic planning. Its primary objective was clear: transform China from an impoverished agricultural society into a modern industrial power. Backed by thousands of Soviet engineers, technicians, and advisors, enormous resources were directed toward heavy industry. New factories, steel mills, railways, power stations, and mining projects appeared across the country. Production of coal, iron, and steel exceeded the ambitious goals established by the plan. For the first time, China also emerged as a significant producer of oil. To many observers, communist economic planning appeared to be delivering remarkable results. Industry, however, represented only half of Mao's vision. The countryside had to be transformed as well. The Communist Party launched an extensive campaign of agricultural collectivization. Individual farms were gradually merged into large cooperatives, where dozens and sometimes hundreds of households pooled their land, livestock, tools, and harvests. By 1956, according to the source, roughly 80% of peasant households belonged to agricultural cooperatives. The reform was not purely economic. It also carried a political purpose. By organizing rural communities into cooperatives, the party strengthened its influence over daily life, production, and political education throughout the countryside. Centuries-old farming traditions were being replaced at remarkable speed. At the time, many celebrated these changes as evidence that socialism was reshaping China for the better. In hindsight, however, they also laid the foundations for a far greater crisis. Encouraged by what appeared to be the success of the first 5-year plan, Mao became increasingly confident in his own leadership. In 1956, he announced a bold new initiative. Let 100 flowers bloom. Let 100 schools of thought contend. The message invited intellectuals, scientists, writers, and academics to offer constructive criticism and fresh ideas that might improve the party's work. The response surprised the leadership. Rather than offering only modest suggestions, many participants openly criticized party policies, bureaucratic abuses, restrictions on free expression, and the growing concentration of political power. Universities became centers of increasingly candid debate. For a brief moment, it appeared that China might be entering a period of greater openness. The atmosphere changed abruptly. Instead of embracing the criticism, Mao and the communist leadership concluded that the movement had exposed dangerous political dissent. The experiment ended almost as quickly as it had begun. The government launched the anti-rightist campaign, targeting those who had spoken out. According to the source material, at least 500,000 men and women were punished. Many endured public humiliation, imprisonment, forced labor, or execution. Among the officials leading the campaign was a rising party figure, Deng Xiaoping, a veteran of the Long March whose influence would become increasingly important in the decades ahead. With opposition silenced and his authority strengthened once again, Mao prepared an even more ambitious transformation. In 1958, China entered its second five-year plan. Mao gave it a name that reflected the scale of his vision, the Great Leap Forward. Its goal was nothing less than to propel China rapidly into the ranks of the world's leading industrial powers. The campaign would attempt to reshape every aspect of Chinese society, and before long, it would produce one of the greatest human catastrophes in modern history. Farmers were instructed to build thousands of small backyard furnaces to produce iron and steel, instead of strengthening industry. The campaign often deprived villages of essential tools while diverting precious labor away from farming during critical harvest seasons. The consequences were catastrophic. A devastating famine spread across the country. Recent estimates attribute at least 45 million excess deaths to the Great Leap Forward, roughly 7% of China's population. It became one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history. By 1960, the Soviet Union abruptly withdrew thousands of advisors from China and suspended many joint industrial projects. The once powerful communist alliance had fractured. The Sino-Soviet split would become one of the defining geopolitical divisions of the Cold War. Meanwhile, tensions were rising on China's western frontier. In 1959, opposition to communist rule erupted into open rebellion in Tibet. The uprising was swiftly suppressed by the People's Liberation Army. Amid the chaos, the 14th Dalai Lama escaped across the Himalayas into India, where he established a government in exile. His departure transformed Tibet into a major international issue and further strained relations between Beijing and New Delhi. Border disputes soon pushed China and India toward open conflict. Both governments claimed sovereignty over large sections of their poorly defined Himalayan frontier. Diplomatic negotiations failed to resolve the disagreement. In October 1962, Chinese forces launched coordinated attacks across multiple sectors of the disputed border. Mao feared that China was following the Soviet Union's path toward what he called revisionism, the gradual abandonment of true socialism. It would become known as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. In May 1966, Mao called upon China's youth to defend the revolution. Millions of students responded enthusiastically. They organized themselves into militant groups known as the Red Guards. Filled with Mao's speeches and political teachings, it soon became one of the most widely distributed books in history. For countless young Chinese, its words were treated almost as sacred doctrine. The Red Guards received extraordinary encouragement from Mao himself. By the late 1960s, Mao Zedong had largely re-established his dominance over the Chinese Communist Party. The Cultural Revolution continued to reshape every aspect of Chinese society. Yet, beneath the surface of apparent unity, an intense struggle for power was unfolding inside the party itself. Among Mao's closest allies was Lin Biao. Lin had helped elevate Mao's personality cult to unprecedented heights. The Little Red Book became compulsory reading throughout the military, schools, and workplaces. The death of Mao Zedong marked the end of one revolutionary era, but it did not immediately answer the question that now confronted China. What should come next? The country remained exhausted after a decade of the Cultural Revolution. Economic growth had stalled, factories operated inefficiently, agricultural production struggled to meet demand. Millions of young people had lost years of education, while political campaigns had left deep scars across Chinese society. In the months following Mao's death, Hui Guofeng emerged as China's new leader. As Mao's chosen successor, Hui pledged to preserve the chairman's legacy. Yet many within the Communist Party believed China needed more than continuity. It needed change. Among those waiting for another opportunity was a familiar figure, Deng Xiaoping. Twice purged during the Cultural Revolution, Deng gradually returned to political influence. Unlike Mao, he placed little emphasis on ideological purity. His focus was practical results. According to Deng, it did not matter whether a cat was black or white, so long as it caught mice. That simple philosophy would soon reshape the future of China. The decisive turning point came in December 1978, during the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee. The Communist Party adopted a dramatically different national priority. Instead of class struggle and permanent revolution, the leadership declared that economic modernization would become China's central mission. It was one of the most important policy shifts in modern Chinese history. Deng introduced a program that became known as Reform and Opening Up. Across rural China, the old people's commune system was gradually dismantled. Under the household responsibility system, farming families once again received direct responsibility for cultivating individual plots of land. After fulfilling state quotas, they could sell surplus crops for profit. For millions of peasants, incentives returned to agriculture for the first time in decades. Food production rose rapidly. Rural incomes increased. The chronic shortages that had characterized much of the Mao era began to ease. Reform soon spread beyond agriculture. State-owned enterprises were granted greater flexibility. Private businesses slowly reappeared. Foreign companies were encouraged to invest in China. To attract international capital and technology, the government established a number of special economic zones, or SEZ, along the southern coast. Among them, one small fishing town would become the most famous of all, Shenzhen, located just across the border from Hong Kong. Shenzhen was transformed into a vast experimental zone where market-oriented policies could be tested before being introduced elsewhere. Within only a few years, construction cranes dominated the skyline, factories multiplied, workers arrived from every corner of China in search of new opportunities. The sleepy coastal settlement began its extraordinary transformation into one of the world's fastest-growing cities. The reforms represented a remarkable departure from Maoist economic policy. China remained under the leadership of the Communist Party. Yet, elements of the market economy were increasingly welcomed. Foreign investment flowed into the country. Exports expanded rapidly. For the first time in decades, millions of Chinese families began experiencing noticeable improvements in their standard of living. The foundations of what many would later call the Chinese economic miracle had been laid. Deng Xiaoping insisted that China was crossing the river by feeling the stones. Reform would proceed cautiously, step by step. Successes would be expanded, failures would be corrected. It was a philosophy very different from the sweeping ideological campaigns of the Mao era. And before long, it would transform not only China's economy, but its place in the world. China's reforms gathered momentum with remarkable speed. Across the countryside, the transformation was dramatic. Over the next 6 years, approximately 97% of peasant households moved away from collective farming toward individual household responsibility. The results were immediate. Agricultural output increased by more than 60%, and for the first time in generations. The recurring cycles of famine that had haunted rural China largely disappeared. The recovery extended far beyond agriculture. Thousands of students, teachers, scientists, and government officials who had been sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution were allowed to return to the cities. Universities reopened. In 1977, the National University Entrance Examination was restored, once again allowing academic achievement rather than political background to determine admission. China began rebuilding the educated workforce that had been disrupted for more than a decade. As the economy expanded, China's confidence abroad also grew. Beijing strengthened diplomatic relations with Western nations. Deng Xiaoping welcomed visits from the prime ministers of Britain and Japan, the president of France, and Queen Elizabeth II. International recognition of China's transformation continued to grow, and Deng himself was named Time magazine's Person of the Year twice. Even Beijing's language toward Taiwan softened. Rather than emphasizing military liberation, the government now promoted the idea of peaceful reunification. To achieve that goal, Deng proposed the formula of one country, two systems, under which Taiwan could retain a high degree of autonomy while becoming part of the People's Republic. Taiwan's President Chiang Kai-shek, the son of Chiang Kai-shek, rejected the proposal. China also sought to reshape how the world viewed the country. The government promoted Pinyin, the Romanized spelling system for Mandarin Chinese. International media gradually abandoned older spellings such as Peking, adopting Beijing instead a symbolic reflection of China's growing influence on the global stage. Yet, while economic reforms accelerated, the Communist Party maintained firm political control. One issue increasingly worried the leadership: China's population. Since 1949, dramatic improvements in public health had nearly doubled the country's population from roughly 550 million to almost 1 billion people. Many policymakers feared such rapid growth would eventually overwhelm the country's economic progress. In 1980, the government introduced one of the most controversial policies in modern Chinese history, the one-child policy. For most urban families, having a second child could result in heavy financial penalties and other administrative sanctions. According to the source material, some local authorities also carried out forced abortions and sterilizations. Although the policy slowed population growth, it produced profound long-term consequences. A generation of single-child families emerged, while a significant gender imbalance developed as male births increasingly outnumbered female births. The government also continued expanding legal protections for women, building upon reforms introduced during the Mao era. China ratified the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 1980. By the late 1970s, the source estimates that up to 90% of urban women were participating in the workforce. Nevertheless, progress remained uneven. Women continued to be underrepresented in political leadership and senior economic positions, while many reforms reached rural communities only gradually. Economic success encouraged new expectations. Many Chinese began asking whether economic liberalization might eventually be followed by political reform. Those hopes increasingly centered on Hu Yaobang, one of Deng Xiaoping's closest allies and the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Known for his openness and willingness to challenge entrenched privileges within the party, who became enormously popular among students, intellectuals, and reform-minded officials. Many believed he would one day succeed Deng as China's paramount leader. Yet, rising public expectations also generated new tensions. In 1986, student demonstrations calling for greater openness and democracy spread across several Chinese cities. When Deng Xiaoping ordered the protests to be suppressed, Hu Yaobang refused to support the crackdown. He was forced to resign and publicly criticize himself before fellow party leaders. 2 years later, Hu suffered a fatal heart attack during a Politburo meeting. His death would trigger an extraordinary wave of public mourning, one that would soon grow into the largest political demonstrations China had witnessed since the founding of the People's Republic. By 1989, China's economic reforms had transformed the country. Factories multiplied, foreign investments surged, millions enjoyed opportunities unimaginable only a decade earlier. Yet prosperity also brought rising expectations. Many Chinese now hoped that economic liberalization would eventually be accompanied by political reform. The death of Hu Yaobang in April 1989 became the catalyst. Widely respected for his openness and reformist views, Hu had been forced from office after refusing to support the suppression of earlier student demonstrations. To many, he had become a symbol of political change denied. Thousands of mourners gathered in Beijing. They made their way to Tiananmen Square, where grief gradually evolved into protest echoing the student movements that had shaped modern Chinese history decades earlier. Exactly 70 years after the May 4th movement of 1919, more than 100,000 students marched through the capital. Their demands centered on greater openness, freedom of speech, government accountability, and political reform. Few called for the overthrow of communist rule. Instead, many insisted they wished to strengthen China by making its government more transparent and responsive. On May 13th, hundreds of students began a hunger strike, hoping to pressure the leadership into meaningful negotiations. Within the Communist Party, opinions were deeply divided. The newly appointed General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, another of Deng Xiaoping's reform-minded protégés, believed the crisis should be resolved peacefully. On May 19th, Zhao personally visited the protesters gathered in Tiananmen Square. Speaking with visible emotion, he told them, "We are already old. We do not matter anymore." It was an extraordinary moment. Many students would remember it as the final public appearance of one of China's leading reformers. Others within the leadership took a far harder line. Premier Li Peng argued that the demonstrations threatened political stability. With Deng Xiaoping's support, his position prevailed. There would be no negotiations, no concessions. Instead, the government declared martial law. On the night of June 3rd to 4th, 1989, soldiers and tanks entered Beijing with orders to clear Tiananmen Square and surrounding streets. The operation ended in bloodshed. According to the source material, official figures reported 218 civilians and 23 security personnel killed, with several thousand injured. The documentary also notes that many observers have questioned these figures, believing the true death toll was considerably higher. In the aftermath, cameras captured one of the most recognizable images of the 20th century. On Chang'an Avenue, an unidentified man stood alone before a column of advancing tanks. For several moments, he refused to move. The image spread rapidly around the world. The anonymous figure became known simply as Tank Man. To many outside China, he became an enduring symbol of individual courage in the face of overwhelming power. International reaction was swift. Governments and media organizations across the world condemned the violence. Inside China, however, the government's position remained unchanged. Only days later, Deng Xiaoping, then 84 years old, described the demonstrations as a counter-revolutionary rebellion, arguing that military action had been fully justified. The political consequences were immediate. Zhao Ziyang, who had visited the students and advocated dialogue, was removed from office. He would spend the next 15 years under house arrest, disappearing almost entirely from public life. Li Peng remained premier for nearly another decade. Later that year, Deng formally stepped back from frontline politics. To many observers, it appeared that China's reform movement had stalled. The country seemed to be moving backward. The events of 1989 severely damaged China's international reputation. Once again, the country found itself diplomatically isolated. Yet history was far from finished. Within only a few years, China would embark on another extraordinary phase of economic transformation. One that would ultimately reshape not only the nation itself, but the global economy. In the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square protests, China's future appeared uncertain. Political reform had come to an abrupt halt. Foreign governments imposed sanctions. International investment slowed, and many questioned whether the era of economic liberalization had reached its end. Within the Communist Party, conservatives argued that rapid reform had gone too far. For a time, China's extraordinary economic momentum seemed to be fading. Yet Deng Xiaoping remained convinced that China's modernization could not be reversed. Although he had formally retired from most official positions, Deng still possessed enormous influence behind the scenes. In 1992, at the age of 87, he embarked on what would become one of the most consequential political journeys in modern Chinese history, the Southern Tour. Traveling through the rapidly developing cities of Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Shanghai, Deng praised the success of market-oriented reforms and urged local officials to move forward with even greater confidence. His message was unmistakable: development is the hard truth. The tour reignited the reform movement and reassured investors that China remained committed to economic opening. The effects were immediate. Foreign investment surged once again. New factories spread across the eastern seaboard. Millions of rural workers migrated to expanding industrial cities in search of opportunity. China increasingly became the preferred manufacturing base for companies from around the world. Its export economy expanded at an unprecedented pace. The country was rapidly transforming into what many would soon call the world's factory. Economic modernization was accompanied by another historic milestone. On July 1, 1997, Hong Kong officially returned to Chinese sovereignty after more than 150 years of British rule. The transfer was carried out under Deng Xiaoping's principle of one country, two systems. Hong Kong would become a special administrative region, retaining its capitalist economy, independent legal system, and a high degree of autonomy while remaining part of the People's Republic of China. The ceremony marked one of the most symbolic moments in modern Chinese diplomacy and was widely celebrated as the peaceful recovery of territory lost. During the 19th century, 2 years later, on December 20, 1999, Macau was also returned to Chinese administration following the end of Portuguese rule. With both Hong Kong and Macau reunited with the mainland, Beijing regarded the process of recovering historically ceded territories as another major step toward national rejuvenation. Only Taiwan remained beyond the control of the People's Republic. China's integration into the global economy accelerated even further in 2001. After more than a decade of negotiations, the country officially joined the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Membership granted Chinese manufacturers broader access to international markets while encouraging greater foreign investment and competition. The impact was enormous. Exports soared. Industrial production expanded rapidly. Global supply chains increasingly centered on Chinese factories. Within only a few years, products labeled "Made in China" had become common in homes across every continent. The pace of change was extraordinary. Modern highways stretched across the country. New airports, ports, and high-speed rail projects connected regions that had once been isolated. Skylines filled with towering office buildings and apartment complexes. Cities such as Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou became symbols of China's astonishing transformation. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty as living standards rose at a pace rarely seen in human history. Yet rapid growth also introduced new challenges. Economic inequality widened, environmental pollution intensified, corruption became an increasingly serious concern. The Communist Party now faced a different question than it had during Mao's era. No longer focused on revolution, it had to determine how to manage the consequences of unprecedented prosperity while preserving political stability. The next generation of leaders would inherit both the remarkable achievements and the growing complexities of China's economic miracle. The tragedy of 1989 left China isolated from much of the world. International criticism intensified. Sanctions were imposed. Many believed the country's remarkable period of reform had come to an abrupt end. Within the Communist Party, conservative voices gained influence, arguing that rapid economic change had encouraged political instability. For a brief moment, it seemed as though China's modernization had stalled. Yet Deng Xiaoping refused to abandon the path of reform. In 1992, despite his advanced age and official retirement, he undertook his historic Southern tour, sending a clear message that China's future still lay in economic opening and development. His intervention revived market reforms and restored confidence among officials, entrepreneurs, and foreign investors alike. From that moment onward, China's economy accelerated with renewed momentum. Although Deng gradually withdrew from public life, the policies he had championed continued under a new generation of leaders. Jiang Zemin, who had risen to national prominence after the events of 1989, oversaw a period of extraordinary economic expansion. Factories multiplied across the eastern coast. Foreign companies established massive production centers throughout China. Exports surged to unprecedented levels. Millions of rural workers migrated to booming industrial cities, fueling one of the largest waves of urbanization in human history. China was rapidly becoming the manufacturing hub of the global economy. A defining milestone came in 2001 when China officially joined the World Trade Organization. Membership integrated the country more deeply into international commerce than ever before. Global corporations expanded their investments. Chinese manufacturers gained wider access to overseas markets. Within only a few years, products bearing the label Made in China had become familiar in households around the world. The country's export-driven economy entered a period of explosive growth that reshaped global supply chains. Following Jiang Zemin, leadership passed to Hu Jintao in 2002. Under Hu, China sought not only rapid economic growth, but also greater social stability. The government invested heavily in highways, airports, ports, and the expanding high-speed rail network. Modern skylines rose across cities that only decades earlier had been dominated by bicycles and low-rise buildings. Hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens experienced rising incomes and improved living standards. The scale of the transformation astonished observers around the world. China's growing confidence was showcased spectacularly in 2008, when Beijing hosted the Summer Olympic Games. The opening ceremony displayed thousands of years of Chinese civilization alongside the country's technological achievements and modern ambitions. For many Chinese citizens, the Olympics symbolized the nation's return to the center of world affairs after what had long been remembered as the century of humiliation. Only weeks later, however, the global financial crisis shook international markets. While many advanced economies entered deep recession, China's government responded with an enormous stimulus program focused on infrastructure and investment. Construction accelerated. Domestic demand expanded. Although growth slowed, China weathered the crisis more successfully than many other major economies, further enhancing its global influence. By the beginning of the new decade, China's transformation was impossible to ignore. The country had become the world's second largest economy. Its factories supplied markets across every continent. Its cities ranked among the fastest growing on Earth. Its political and economic influence continued to expand throughout Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond. Yet new challenges accompanied this extraordinary success. Corruption had become deeply entrenched, environmental degradation intensified, economic inequality widened. The Communist Party now faced the difficult task of sustaining prosperity while preserving political stability. In 2012, another transition of leadership began. A relatively little-known party veteran prepared to assume China's highest office. His name was Xi Jinping. Under his leadership, China would enter yet another chapter, one defined by sweeping anti-corruption campaigns, an increasingly assertive foreign policy, and an ambitious vision for the country's future on the global stage. By the dawn of the 21st century, China's transformation had become impossible to ignore. Only a few decades earlier, it had been a largely rural nation emerging from the turmoil of revolution and political campaigns. Now, it stood at the center of the global economy. Its factories supplied markets around the world, its cities expanded at breathtaking speed, and its influence reached every continent. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, opening an entirely new chapter in its economic development. Chinese products became more competitive than ever before. International companies shifted manufacturing operations to China in unprecedented numbers. Drawn by abundant labor and rapidly improving infrastructure, exports surged. Within only a few years, China had become the world's largest exporter, while its economy expanded at annual rates of 10, 12, and even 14%. The World Bank described it as the fastest sustained expansion by a major economy in history. The pace of industrialization reshaped the country. Modern skylines rose where farmland had once stretched for miles. New highways, ports, airports, and railways connected regions that had long remained isolated. Millions escaped poverty as new opportunities emerged across manufacturing, technology, and international trade. Yet, this astonishing growth also came with significant costs. Carbon emissions rose dramatically. Air pollution became one of the country's most pressing environmental challenges, reflecting the immense scale of China's industrial expansion. In 2008, Beijing hosted the Summer Olympic Games. The event became a global showcase for a nation transformed. The spectacular opening ceremony celebrated thousands of years of Chinese civilization while presenting an image of a modern, prosperous, and increasingly confident country. For many Chinese citizens, the Olympics symbolized the nation's remarkable recovery after generations of war, revolution, and foreign domination. The following year brought another historic milestone. In 2009, China overtook Japan to become the world's second-largest economy, surpassed only by the United States. The balance of global economic power was shifting. China had firmly re-established itself as one of the world's leading nations. Yet the country's extraordinary success did not eliminate every challenge. Far from Beijing, protests emerged in Tibet and Xinjiang, where many residents opposed what they perceived as injustices under Communist Party rule. According to the source material, these demonstrations were met with force and mass detention. At the same time, the government continued expanding its systems of surveillance and censorship. The documentary describes the Great Firewall as a tool intended to shield Chinese citizens from harmful foreign influences, while noting that internet activity was continuously monitored for signs of dissent. According to the source, the Communist Party maintained that stability, security, and prosperity came first, but these achievements carried a price. Freedoms commonly taken for granted in many other parts of the world remained tightly restricted. Then, in 2012, another peaceful transfer of leadership took place. After a decade in office, the cautious technocrat Hu Jintao handed responsibility to a new generation. His successor was Xi Jinping. A full century had passed since the abdication of the last Qing emperor. During that time, China had endured revolution, civil war, foreign invasion, famine, political upheaval, and extraordinary economic transformation. The road had been long, bloody, and turbulent. Yet, as the source concludes, there could be little doubt that the Middle Kingdom had once again resumed a central place in global affairs. The story of modern China was far from over, but from the collapse of the Qing Dynasty to its emergence as a global power, the nation had undergone one of the most remarkable transformations in human